Hey guys, and welcome to my channel. In this video, we'll be talking about Azure App Service. So I'll be explaining when to use a service like Azure App Service, some of the features of Azure App Service, and of course, I'll be doing a little demonstration for you. So with that being said, let's just get into it. So what is Azure App Service? Azure App Service is a platform as a service resource on Azure that allows you to host your application. Now, on Azure, you can host your application in what is called as infrastructure as a service, and those are things like VMs and even AKS. But you can also host your applications on what is known as platform as a service, where, as you can see in this diagram, Microsoft or Azure essentially manages the runtime, the middlewares, the operating system, and everything else apart from your own code. So in this case, as a developer, all you have to worry about is just writing code, and that's it. And you can just host it on Azure with no maintenance of any operating system, any updates, any middlewares, etc. And Azure App Service supports most of your runtime versions and types. But if you want to use your own custom runtime version for one reason or another, you can package your application into a container and then host that container into Azure App Service. Now, what are the advantages of using a service like Azure App Service? Well, first, it's obviously more productivity because Azure manages all the infrastructure, including security, operating systems, and updates. So all you have to worry about as a developer is just writing code. Next is, of course, ease of refactor. Now, if you already have an application that is running on premises, you can easily refactor that application to rehost it on Azure App Service. So you don't have to do very minimal code changes or even no code changes apart from maybe changing some dependencies in your code. Next is elasticity. And what I mean by elasticity is you can easily scale out or scale in the app service depending on the demand of your application and depending on the traffic. And last but not least, there's native integration with other Azure services like Azure Security Center, API management, storage accounts, and other AI services like Azure Cognitive Services, for example. So the big question is when to use a service like Azure App Service, because as I said, there are multiple compute resources that you can use to host your application. So you can host it on a VM, you can host it on an AKS resource, you can host it on a container instance. So there are a lot of options for you. Now, the question is when to use a platform as a service or Azure App Service. And the answer is if you have an on-premises application or an application that is running on a VM and you simply just want to lift and shift that same application without doing a lot of refactoring, Azure App Service is a very good choice. Now, on the other hand, if you have just a very simple N-tier application architecture, as you can see on this picture, App Service will also be your best bet. Now, if you have a microservices architecture, there are other offerings on Azure that are way better, of course. And on a side note, you don't need to use a microservice architecture for every single application. So as I said, if it's a very simple application with maybe not a lot of traffic, then App Service is really your best bet. It's the easiest to get started with, and it allows you to leverage some of the cloud native technologies on Azure. So it's very good if you're just getting started. Now, if your application is containerized, you can also run it on Azure App Service, as mentioned in my previous slide. But if you want container orchestration, and what I mean by container orchestration is where you have multiple containers and you want to take advantage of things like scaling, self-healing, and things like that, then you should be using AKS instead, which obviously is way better for a microservices architecture approach. But if you're going just with a simple N-tier architecture application, then you can just use Azure App Service and take advantage of all the cloud native technologies we have on Azure. Next, let's talk about App Service Plan, which is a very confusing topic. So bear with me while I try to explain it as simple as I can. So on Azure, you have what is called an App Service Plan, which is a different resource than an Azure App Service. So you have a resource called App Service Plan, and you have another resource called Azure App Service. And Azure App Service resource lives inside that Azure App Service Plan resource. Now, you might ask, what is an app service plan? When an app service plan is simply an environment, okay, filled with workers or essentially VMs, and then you have other stuff like load balancers, file servers, things like that, which you don't have to worry about at all. Because again, this is a platform as a service, and there are a lot of things that work behind the scenes that make all the magic work. So what an app service plan is just a series of load balancers and most importantly, a series of workers or VMs. Now, the actual app service resources themselves run on those VMs or on those workers. And under a certain app service plan, you can create multiple applications or multiple app service resources, essentially representing your application. And those applications will share all the workers. So in this case, I have two different applications, and those two different applications are going to be shared across all the workers to again to leverage the power and the resources of all the workers that you have. And depending on what app service plan you use, you have a certain limitation on the number of workers you're going to have in that environment. So I believe if you go with a premium one, you can create up to 20 workers, and if you're just going with a standard one, you can create up to 10 workers. Now, if you zoom into a specific app service resource or a web application, this is where your application actually runs. So this is what we call a sandbox or a deployment slot, and this is exactly where the application runs. So if you zoom into a specific app service resource, it runs in what is called a deployment slot. Now, if you're using a free or a basic version of app service, I don't think you're going to have deployment slots. I don't have the option, for example, of having different deployment slots for the same application or different runtimes, let's call it that way. But again, most people just use either the standard or the premium version. So essentially what you're going to have is just a series of deployment slots or just one deployment slot where you're going to actually run your application. And to summarize this in a slide, you first create an app service plan, which gives you that environment with the set of workers or VMs and load balancers, which are again things that you don't see or manage, that you can utilize. Then you create an Azure App Service resource representing your specific application that lives inside that app service plan. And then the application itself or the Azure App Service resource itself will have deployment slots or sandboxes. And last but not least, that application with the deployment slot will run on all the workers, again, to leverage the power of all of these workers. So now let's go through a demo of creating an app service. And what I said in the previous module will make much more sense. So if I click on create and I choose my subscription and then my resource group, and then let's give this test Node application because I'm gonna deploy a Node.js application. And then, as I said, you can publish this as a container or just as a code. In this case, I don't have a container. I don't need to use a container in my specific case because my runtime is supported. So I got Node 14 long-term support. And usually Azure picks the operating system that's recommended by them. Now, there's slight differences when you use Linux and Windows, like some things will be supported only on Linux, other things will just be supported on Windows. Essentially, this doesn't really matter for you because remember, this is a platform as a service and you never have to worry about the operating system. But again, usually Azure picks this based on what runtime you pick, again, depending on what they support and to what they don't support. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as Linux, and here I'm going to use West Europe as my region. And here's where you choose the app service plan, because again, the Azure App Service resource or the web app resource is going to live inside an app service plan. So in this case, I need to create one or just choose an existing one. In my case, I'm just going to create a new one, and let's call it test app plan. I'm very bad at naming resources, as you guys can tell. And in this case, it's picked a default one for me, which is Premium V2. Now I just want to show you just the different sizes that we have. So Azure just split this into like a dev test, production, and isolated. Dev test is, from the name, is just for development purposes. They don't recommend running this in a production environment with a lot of users, but as you can see what different resources you have on these workers. And you have the production tier, and here you can see total ACU, and ACU is basically, this is like a number that represents the performance of a worker or a VM relative to the VM series. So you know, on the VM series, you have like A series, you have the D series, etc. So I think the A0 VM is 50 ACU. In this case, it's 210 ACU, which is equivalent to a D series VM. Okay, so that's like the way they measure it. It's just relative to the VM series. And here you can see a couple of different features, which I'm gonna talk about in the future modules. And last but not least, you have this isolated network environment, which is called app service environment. Now, this is a bit more complicated and a bit more expensive. Not every customer uses those, to be honest. But if you essentially just want an isolated network just for yourself, then you would probably go with something something like that. Because the production and the dev test, even though the workers are very powerful, you don't have to worry about any of the stuff like the load balancers, etc. It's essentially a shared tenant environment, which means like a lot of customers are going to be running on the same app service lambda, but you just don't see it. Okay, if you want something just isolated for you with the isolated network, isolated everything, just go with the isolated plan, which is known as an app service environment. I'll probably do just a different video on Azure App Service environment because there's a lot more into it. So let's just go with the default here with the premium. Let's go through the options. So we have some deployment options. So here you can enable continuous deployment. I'm gonna set that after I create this web app, so I leave this blank for now. Let's go to monitoring. In this case, it's asking me if I want to enable application insights. And with this, I think this is a very useful feature if you just want to enable application insights outside the box. So you don't have to do any code configuration, any of that stuff. You just enable it, and it basically just attaches a pre-installed agent with all the SDK configuration to your application. So you essentially don't have to write any code, and you can easily leverage a service as powerful as application insights. In this case, I'm just going to keep this as no, and I don't need any tags. So I'm just going to create that resource and play around with it while I wait for it. All right, so now that my app service resource is created, I just want to show you around and do a little bit of a demonstration on how you can deploy your application into Azure App Service. Now, just really quickly here, if you see on this on the screen, we have an overview page, and you can see this app service plan. And if I go to the app service plan, here you can see that the app service plan itself can have several different apps. In this case, I only have one application, and that's why you can only see this test node application. We also have this a staging slot. I'm going to talk about that in a bit, but as you can see, this is where you can see all the different app service resources under that app service plan. So if I go back to my Azure App Service resource, the question now is, how do I deploy my code locally, okay, that lives locally into Azure App Service? Now, there are a couple of different ways you can do it. The simplest way is just to do that straight from Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. So let me demonstrate that really quickly. If I go to Visual Studio, I have a very simple Node.js application. Doesn't do anything fancy, but if you install an extension called Azure App Service, you can basically go through that, and then you would log into your subscription, and then you would find your app service that you created. And all you have to do is just click this button, Deploy to Web App, and this will automatically deploy whatever you have on this folder into Azure App Service. Now, nobody does that, or at least I hope that nobody does that in production. Now, in production, you would typically have a source control repository, so whether that's GitHub, GitLab, Azure DevOps, whatever that is, and you would typically deploy your code from that source control repository. So this is what I'm going to demonstrate actually in this video. So if I go back to the portal, we have what is known as Deployment Center. Okay, so this is where you essentially easily create your CI/CD workflows, or what is known as continuous integration, continuous deployment. Basically, it's a very fancy term to imply that whatever you push into GitHub or any source control repository, it will actually deploy that into this Azure App Service resource. So if I go to Deployment Center, you have to choose the source, or what is known as the code source. In this case, again, you can use local Git, Bitbucket, external Git, whatever that is. You can choose. In this case, I'm choosing GitHub. I hope you use GitHub because it's the best. And the organization is my name, and you can choose whatever repository you want. In this case, I have the app service demo repository, and then you would choose the branch. Okay. In this case, I don't have any other branch except for the main one because it's a very simple application. And then after that, all you have to do is just click save, and we'll wait for that to finish. And now, if we go back to GitHub, I have this code in my GitHub repository. If I go to actions, we can see that Azure App Service added a GitHub action, which essentially just deploys whatever I have in my GitHub repository into App Service. And as you can see, it created that YAML file for me. Okay, I did not have to do anything. All I had to do is just click a single button on the portal, and it did all the magic for me. So as you can see here, it's queuing at the moment, but it should essentially deploy whatever I have in my GitHub repository into Azure App Service. So let's give this a bit. And now if we go back to our portal and we click on browse, we should be able to see our deployed application. So as you can see, it's saying welcome to our production environment. Now, if we go back to the portal, again, I just want to show you a quick demo of the deployment slots. Now, again, my application is going to run on a deployment slot. It's not going to run on Azure App Service resource. It's going to run on a deployment slot. Here, I just cheated and created a staging slot without demonstrating that for you. But essentially, to create a new slot, all you have to do is just click Add Slot and just give it a name. And it's going to be a suffix to the name of the Azure App Service. In this case, it's called staging. Okay, now 100% of my traffic is on the production slot. Okay, so this is the default one. When you first create an Azure App Service resource, the default deployment slot is called the same as the Azure App Service name. So this is what is known as the production slot. Anything you create is just going to be added as a suffix. In this case, it's staging. Okay. Now, if I go to configuration section, okay, for this Azure App Service resource, I can see that I have an environment variable here, and the value is called production. So under application settings, here you can define environment variables, which will be pushed into your application. In this case, I have an environment variable called production, and this is why we saw the word production when we ran the app. And this is known as deployment slot setting specific. Okay, now what this means is that basically this is specific to the production slot, so the default one. If I go back to the deployment slots and I go to the staging one, I can go to the configuration tab under settings, and then if I check the app settings, I created a different environment variable with the value staging. Okay, again, this is deployment slot specific because this is specific to this staging slot. And the reason why I created that environment variable is just to demonstrate the difference between to visually demonstrate the difference between my staging application and the production application. Okay, this is my staging application. As you can see, in this case, if I click on browse, you can see here I'm not seeing my deployed application. This is the standard application that you will see when you first create an Azure App Service resource. Okay, the reason for that is because I haven't deployed anything to this staging slot. Okay, so what I can do is I can simply go to Deployment Center and I can deploy the application to this deployment slot, just like I did for the main production slot. Okay, and it's gonna pick up the environment variable with the value staging. Okay, essentially just to differentiate between them. In this case, I'm not gonna do that because there's visible difference between this staging slot application because it's just giving us that and the production slot application, which is giving us our deployed application. So there's obviously a difference between them. Now, if I go to deployment slots again, what we can do is what is known as swap. Okay, so we can swap, or in this case, I'm choosing the source, which is the staging. I'm swapping the staging and the production slot. So essentially, I'm putting the staging slot instead of the production slot. Okay, let me click swap and let's wait for that to finish. Let's give that a bit. Now that it's done, I've essentially swapped the staging slot with my production slot. Okay, so now, now that I've swapped that, if I go back to the overview and then I click on browse, you can see I'm getting the staging slot application, not my deployed application. Okay, even though I'm in this I'm in the main deployment slot. Okay, so if I go back to the deployment slot and go back to the staging one, now if I browse the staging one, I can see it is saying welcome to our staging environment. Okay, because I swapped the main production one with the staging one. Okay, now why is this important? Now, typically the best practice here is to create another environment called staging environment. And what you would do is you would go to that staging environment and then you would deploy your application to that staging environment. Okay, and then you would do just a test. In this example, I'm just browsing that, I check if everything is okay. And only if that is okay, I would swap that with the production slot. Okay, again, it just gives you an extra environment to try things out, okay, because you don't want to always be deploying to production. Okay, so anytime you do a change, you don't want to be continuously deploying that to the main production app that your clients are accessing. You can just deploy it to a different deployment slot. Okay, you can test things out, and if you know that things are okay, things are perfect, you can just swap it again into production and things work fine. So this is essentially what is known as the Control Z of Azure App Service. Okay, because let's say things went really wrong with the staging environment, I don't care. Okay, I don't care. It's not deployed to production. I can fix it, and then only when I'm sure that things are working fine, I just swap it to the main production deployment slot. Okay, and another subtle benefit is notice that I'm deploying everything to staging, and at the end, I'm just swapping it to production. Okay, so there's essentially no downtime for my clients because my clients are already accessing the production application. Everything is working fine. Whatever changes I'm introducing them to the staging environment, and then I'm swapping them. Okay, so for the client, that's perfect because there's no downtime. We don't have to deal with any downtimes and things like that. So this is a very subtle benefit, but it's super, super, super important because I don't want to be deploying things into my production application whenever I'm doing any changes. So this really simplifies changes, new releases, and things like that. So this is a very subtle benefit that I just want to bring to your attention. All right, let's now talk about some of the features of Azure App Service and what you can configure, what you cannot configure, and things like that. So let's start with the configuration tab under the settings blade. And under configuration, you can here configure what is known as environment variable. So this is essentially your .env file. So this is what is known as application setting. In this case, I have an environment variable called environment, and then I specified a certain value that's hidden for now. And essentially, those variables will be pushed into your application once it's deployed into Azure App Service. So you can securely store your environment variables in the centralized repository on Azure App Service. Next, you have obviously connection strings, and here you can leverage those connection strings if you want to connect to your databases, and now you can connect to things like application insights. Next, we have the general settings, and I'm going to go through those really quickly. So here, essentially, you choose the stacks, and all of these are pretty much pre-populated when I first created this Azure App Service. You have things like FTP state, and you have things like HTTP version, which you can specify. WebSocket, so if you're deploying a WebSocket application, you have to toggle that on. You have things like always on, so basically just to allow your app to always stay on and not essentially just be idled out due to inactivity to keep your application warm. And then you have things like ARR affinity, and we always recommend to turn this off. This is essentially a cookie that gets sent from the client to your server that allows the client to connect to a specific instance every single time. Now, this is obviously not recommended because when you use app service, you typically want to take advantage of things like scaling out and scaling in. So you don't want to be using things like ARR affinity to connect to a specific instance. Now, if you're building a stateful application and you want to track some states, like for example sessions, what is recommended is to use an external session store or external cache like Azure Redis cache. And here you have things like remote debugging. I think this is interesting to do a different video on it. It's not supported for this specific runtime stack. And we have things like incoming client certificate. And what this basically means is that any client that connects to this web app would require a certificate. Okay, so in this case, I'm just ignoring this. But if, let's say, I have a very secure application, maybe an enterprise application that's only used internally, that's super secure, and I only want certain clients to be able to access that, I would need to require a certificate to be present from those clients. And we have also this path mappings. Now, this is only specific to Linux containers, so I think I'm going to skip this for now, but you can read more about it in the documentation. Now let's move to the authentication section, which is a very confusing topic. So again, I'll try to explain it as simple as I can. So essentially with authentication, this allows you to seamlessly integrate your Azure App Service to Azure Active Directory. And by the way, before going through that, I would really highly recommend to watch my first YouTube video on Azure Active Directory because it's going to explain things like app registration, service principles, and things like that. And feel free to watch, of course, other YouTube videos, but I'm going to assume you know what a service principal is, what an app registration is, and things like that. So essentially, again, with authentication, it just allows you to easily integrate your Azure App Service with Azure Active Directory. And you can integrate that with either your Microsoft identity, or you can even integrate that with third-party identity providers like Facebook, Amazon, essentially allowing you to sign in with third-party providers. In this case, I'm just going to choose Microsoft because I want my users to authenticate using their Microsoft accounts. So here I'm just going to create a new app registration. I don't want to pick an existing one. I'm just going to leave the same pre-populated name. And here you have some supported account types. Now, in this case, when I choose current tenant, that means only users registered in my current tenant are allowed to essentially authenticate, sign in, and use my application. You can choose things like personal Microsoft accounts, for example, where you would essentially allow users to use their personal Microsoft accounts to sign in and authenticate in this application. But I'm going to keep this as current tenant. Next, I'm going to keep this, but I'm going to keep this as current tenant. So next we have what we call restrict access, and basically here you have two options. Okay, when you say require authentication, that means every single request from the client or from the user is going to require authentication. Okay, so the user essentially cannot do anything in the application before authenticating. Okay, now things like that are maybe very useful if you have a very simple line of business application that's internal and you only want authenticated internal users in your corporate network to be able to use that application. That's super useful. You don't have to write any code for something like that. However, for most public websites, you don't want to require the user to authenticate before doing absolutely anything. Okay, so think of Amazon, for example. Okay, you can use Amazon without logging into Amazon. So for example, you can see other products posted in Amazon. You can view reviews of other products, things like that. You don't have to be signed in to view all that stuff. Okay, so not everything is authenticated, or not everything requires authentication. Okay, in Amazon. Now, if you want to be able to add products, sell products, whatever that is, you need to obviously authenticate. Okay, but a website like Amazon or any other public-facing website, you typically would not require authentication in every single request. Okay, again, this is very useful for a simple line of business application, because again, you essentially don't have to write code. If I keep this as require authentication, any single time that the user accesses my website, he would have to first be authenticated, which essentially has to sign in, and then you'll be able to use my website. I'm going to demonstrate that, and it will make much more sense after that. So if you choose allow unauthenticated access, here essentially, like, all it does is just literally register the Azure App Service resource in Active Directory, but you would have to essentially write some code to be able to customize when users are allowed to visit certain routes and things like that. So here with this option, you have to write some code. Okay, and here you can specify what you want to do with unauthenticated requests. So essentially, you have some recommendations here. So in my case, I'm just using a website. I'm not using an API in this case per se. Okay, I'm just using a simple website. So in this case, I'm just going to leave it as HTTP 302. If you're developing APIs, you would want to go with that option, because then you'd have to deal with things like callback URIs and things like that, which we're not going to go through for now. But for our simple website, we're just going to go with the HTTP 302, and then I would click on that. So now, if I go back to my website again, now anything that the user does in my website, he should be authenticated before doing that. Okay, so if I click on browse, this is gonna work because I'm already logged in and my session is already maintained. But if I go to my private browser and I visit the same website, I'm gonna be prompted to log in. Okay, I'm not gonna go through the whole process, but essentially this is the flow for any client. Okay, whenever he visits our website, he will have to authenticate first. Okay. Again, it's a very simple one. If you want more customization, you would have to go with that other options, and then you would have to write some code to customize which route you want the users to be authenticated in and which route you don't want them to be authenticated in. Now let's talk about some of the extra features of Azure App Service. So we have application insights here. So I've explained that briefly when I created this Azure App Service service, but essentially here you can just turn on application insights without doing any changes on your code. I explained this in greater details in my previous Azure video on application insights, so I highly recommend you watch that as well. And then we have the identity section, and basically this again, this registers the Azure App Service on Active Directory so that you can then assign this Azure App Service permissions to access other Azure resources. So for example, if you want this Azure App Service to be able to read from a storage account, you can simply turn this on and it would create a managed identity, and then you can specify permissions on that service to be able to read from the storage account. So essentially, it's like creating a user on Azure, but it's actually an application, and then you can give permissions to that applications just like how you give permissions to a user. So this is known as managed identities. And then you have backups here, of course, so you can back up your applications and you can restore some snapshots of your previous applications and things like that. And the next section we have is custom domains. So essentially here you can add your own custom domain, because when you first create an Azure App Service resource, you'll be given a standard domain given by Azure. So that's not something you own, but you can of course attach your own domain if you have one here. So you can either buy one from third-party providers, or you can buy one from Azure itself. Next, we have TLS and SSL bindings and all that stuff. I'm not going to go into greater details into that, but what this basically is that you can attach an SSL certificate to your Azure App Service application to essentially be able to utilize HTTPS. Okay, so that's essentially a certificate that you own, and you would bind that certificate to your domain in order to be able to leverage HTTPS. So that's when you see the secure sign on the website. The reason why I'm seeing this connection is secure sign is because Azure itself is actually providing me with a certificate that proves that this is actually Azure. So if you want to prove that you are whatever custom domain that you have purchased, then you have to bind a certificate to it. And you might ask, where do I get this certificate? Well, there are many different ways of getting a certificate. The easiest way to get a certificate in this case is to just buy the Azure managed certificate. So you can, as you can see here, you can either upload a certificate of your own, you can import it from Key Vault, you can import an app service certificate, or you can just simply allow Azure to create an app service managed certificate. So this is by far the easiest option if you just want to quickly leverage HTTPS in your application. Next, we have networking. I'm going to skip this for now because I'm going to talk about that in details in my next slide. Then we have scale up of the app service plan. So when you first choose the app service plan when you first create the resource, you're not just locked into that. So you can always scale up the app service plan. You know, if you think that maybe this certain pricing tier is not cutting it for you, so you can always scale up, you can always scale down if you feel like you're spending way too much money for no reason. So that's a cool feature we have. And then you have scale out, which is one of the prominent features of Azure App Service. So you can essentially scale the number of VMs or workers that your app service plan is using. And you can either do that manually, okay, and that depends on what app service plan you have, or you can simply go with the custom auto scale option. So with the custom auto scale option, basically what it does is that you would have to choose a metric that defines the criteria of the scale out or scale in. So the most popular metric in this case is percentage CPU. So you can simply scale based on percentage CPU metrics. So you can do things like, please scale out my application by 3 instances if the percentage CPU utilization is more than 70%. So you know that if the percentage CPU is more than 70%, then you're probably getting a lot of traffic on your website, and it's a good idea for you to auto scale that app service plan to more instances. So you can choose to scale it up to the maximum defined depending on what app service plan you have. Then we have this app service plan, which we already touched on. So this is a blade where you can access the app service plan. You can also change the app service plan as well if you'd like. And here you can leverage SSH and to be able to access your application using SSH essentially, because this is again a Linux operating system at the end. Then we have what is known as advanced tools. Now this advanced tools is also known as Kudo, and this is actually the deployment engine of Azure App Service. So again, you know that we have a deployment slot. It's what the application gets deployed in a deployment slot, but this Kudo environment is like actually the deployment environment. Okay, so this is where your application gets deployed, and here you can access a lot of important information. So for example, you can check what app settings have been passed. Now some of the app settings is ones that you create, but some of them are just there behind the scenes that are being passed by the Azure App Service. So you can here check again the app settings, you know what the system information is, and you can even SSH into the operating system, you know, check some of the bin files and things like that. But what I personally like is this log stream tab. Basically, this allows you to view the output of your traces from your application in real time. Okay, so again, if you feel like your application is not performing as well enough, if you have if your application is simply not starting up, you've tried restarting and all of that, this is a very good blade to go through. So this is the log stream blade, and you can see traces from your applications in real time. So you'll be able to spot errors, of course, assuming that you have a proper logging mechanism in your application, which I hope you do. Next, we have API management. So this brings me back to the native integration features that I brought up in the beginning of this video. So with Azure App Service, there's native integration with many of the popular services. So API management is one of them. You can integrate it with Azure Cognitive Services, storage accounts, and things like that. So API management here is just an extra blade that allows you to seamlessly integrate your Azure App Service with an API management service. And then here you can also define your API definition. So if you have an API definition, you can always import it to this blade. And then you have here CORS, which is cross-origin resource sharing. Basically, what this means is instead of just doing that in your code, so typically in your code, you would allow certain origins to talk to your application. Maybe that's your front-end application. But instead of doing that in code, you can just simply allow the origins right from this blade. Next, we have the alerts tab. Here, basically, you can create alerts targeting this app service resource. I'm not going to go through that into greater details. Here, you can see some of the platform metrics of Azure App Service. So this is not something you pay for. This is just standard platform metrics that are there on most Azure resources, and you can certainly leverage them, create some dashboards, create some alerts based on these metrics, auto-scale rules based on these metrics, and things like that. And here you have the logs blade. Basically, if you decide to send diagnostic logs from this Azure App Service resource to Log Analytics, this is just a view for you to view the logs from your Azure App Service. So first of all, what you have to do is basically create a diagnostic settings. And with the diagnostic settings, you can be able to send a couple of different logs from this Azure App Service resource. So you can send HTTP logs, the console logs themselves, app logs, file audit logs, and a lot of other things. So you can choose to send these to Log Analytics, Event Hub, or storage accounts. So that's a cool thing. It's still in preview, but a lot of customers actually use that. And then you have these app service logs. So you can essentially collect your standard output and standard error logs into an FTP route. So that's also a nice thing. We have also the log stream. So basically, this allows you to look at your console logs from your application in real time. So this is what I showed you in the Kudu website. I personally don't like this blade itself. I like to use that on the Kudu website, which I've just shown you previously. But again, you can access it from here if you want something seamless. So that's pretty much it with all the features of Azure App Service. I think that's pretty much it. In the next slide, I'm going to be talking more about the network part. So let's get into it. Now let's talk about networking on Azure App Service. So let me briefly explain this diagram. So this shows you the app service plan, but in a greater detail than in my previous slide. So basically with an app service plan, as I mentioned, you have a series of front ends, which are some load balancers, you have some file servers, and of course you have the actual workers. Now, this is essentially a multi-tenant environment, which means that this environment is actually shared across multiple customers. So you don't get just an isolated environment. If you want an isolated environment, you have to use Azure App Service environment, which is the isolated tier. This right here is a shared environment. So the workers themselves, of course, are not shared. Those are specific to you. But what is shared is the load balancers, so the front ends, the file servers, and all of the other infrastructure bits that make this whole thing work. So those front ends have what we call the inbound IP addresses. So every single Azure App Service resource is going to have a specific inbound IP address. Okay, so that's just reserved for your application. Okay. However, in the App Service plan, there are a series of outbound IP addresses. Okay, so every customer in that shared environment will get a specific set of outbound IP addresses. Okay, so the outbound IP address, so the IP address that is coming from your Azure App Service has specific numbers of or specific sets of outbound IP addresses. So you might ask, why is this important? Because let's say if you want to allow specific IP addresses to access your storage account, you would have to use those outbound IP addresses, okay? Because your application is gonna first communicate to the outbound IP address, and then the outbound IP address will then communicate with whatever service you're trying to communicate, whether that's your own virtual network with a specific firewall configuration or your storage account with another firewall configuration. So that's essentially how networking works on Azure App Service. Now, when we say networking, what do we really mean by networking? So we have to split it up into both inbound and outbound. So with inbound, you're essentially concerned with how is the outside world communicating with my Azure App Service. Okay, so that's the answer that's the question we want to answer. Okay, now, if you just have a public website, you don't essentially care a lot about that stuff because it's just a public website, anyone can access it. Okay, but if you're developing something, maybe of an enterprise application, a line of business application, or anything internal, you have to start thinking about inbound communication and start thinking about how to restrict certain IP addresses to talk to my Azure App Service resource. So with inbound, we have a couple of different options. So we have what we call access restrictions. And with access restrictions, these are like network security groups with a VM, so NSGs. And here you can specify which IP addresses are allowed to talk to your Azure App Service resource. You can specify, so just IP addresses, you can specify service endpoints. So with service endpoints, these are essentially Azure services like storage account, service bus, things like that. So with service tags, you essentially make this Azure App Service resource known to the other services like storage account, service bus, and things like that. So these are access restrictions, which are essentially the network security groups of your Azure App Service. Then you have what we call app assigned address. And here where you essentially, I've explained this briefly before here, where you essentially bind a certificate to your IP address. Okay, so that's with the SSL stuff, the HTTPS stuff, and all of that. So we also have private endpoint, of course. So here, if you want to control the traffic from maybe your on-premises network or your Azure virtual network to the Azure App Service, you can configure that traffic to go through the Microsoft backbone infrastructure, apart from the, as opposed to just the public internet. So you can leverage something like private endpoint. Now, if I go back to the portal and if I go to the networking tab, you can see here we have a section of inbound traffic, and you can see the inbound IP address of my Azure App Service. And you can also here see the outbound IP addresses that is used by my Azure App Service plan. So here you can see the inbound traffic option. So you have these this access restriction that I just spoke about. So you can add some rules. So you can call it whatever you want. You can give it a priority, and you can give it a specific type. So whether it's a specific IP address, service tag, a whole virtual network, and things like that. So that's something pretty cool to do. This is the app assigned address. Again, this is where you bind your certificate to your IP address. That's why it's called app assigned address. And then we have the private endpoints, of course, which is when you configure communication that goes through the Microsoft backbone into your Azure App Service, as opposed to traffic going through the public internet, which is an unsecure medium, of course. Now let's go back to the slides and let's talk about the outbound communication. So with outbound, we are concerned with how is my Azure App Service communicating with the outside world through outbound connections. Okay, we have a couple of different options for that. Okay. The first one is just a classic VNet integration. And with that, you would integrate the Azure App Service resource with your virtual network. So essentially, you are basically introducing the Azure App Service resource to your virtual network. Okay, so that makes it very easy to configure firewall rules, inbound NSGs, and things like that. So essentially, like putting your app service into a virtual network. It's not exactly putting into an Azure virtual network. This is more of the Azure App Service environment, which I mentioned, but this just integrates your Azure App Service resource with the VNet integration, essentially just introducing them to each other. And then you have something like hybrid connections. So with hybrid connections, basically what you have is an Azure Relay service that sits in between your Azure App Service resource and your on-premises resource. So the way this works is your Azure App Service just has to talk to the Azure Relay service, and the Azure Relay service will then forward that communication to the on-premises service. Okay. I personally did not see a lot of use cases for these hybrid connections. I typically see customers using VNet integrations, because with VNet integrations, you can also configure traffic to your on-premises networks by essentially having a VPN gateway inside your Azure virtual network. So you can forward traffic from your Azure App Service resource into the virtual network, which has the VPN gateway that then forwards traffic to the on-premises network. Now, if we go back to the portal, you can see here with the outbound traffic, we have those two features. So the first one is the VNet integration. Essentially, you can just simply choose whatever VNet you want to pair, and you can just add that here. And with hybrid connections, as I said, you can just create a hybrid connections that would create an Azure Relay service behind the scenes, and you can talk to your on-premises environment that way. So that essentially brings me to the end of this video. I hope you found this very useful. Please do give me some feedback if you don't like specific stuff. If you don't like specific stuff, do let me know what you like and what you dislike, and I'll take that feedback into consideration.